This is getting started with Launchdate for Sys Admins. My name is Matt Hansen. I'm a Sys. My name is Matt Hansen. I'm a system administrator with the College of Education here at Penn State. So, welcome to all you who aren't from the area. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. In the college, we manage about 300 Macs for faculty and staff. We're about 50-50 Mac to PC. Prior to this, I worked for a K-12 school district in Milwaukee. We had about 1,000 Macs, and prior to that, a laptop university with about 4,000 Macs. So how many of you already know what Launchdate is? Good number. How many of you are actually already using it? Fewer. Okay. Did anyone go to the intro to command line or scripting presentations? Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is build off that presentation and show you how you can use Launchdate to run your scripts. And feel free to ask me any questions along the way if anything's unclear or if I'm going too fast. So first up is, what is Launchdate? Simply, Launchdate does two things. It starts processes on demand, if needed and only if needed. That's what they call the on-demand in Launchdate. And it also monitors processes and restarts them if it needs to. So Launchdate has been available since 10.4. It's available on both client and server, which means it should be always available to you unless you're managing anything older than 10.4. So my question is, if it's been around for so long, why aren't more people using it? So that's what I'm going to try to help you do. Starting with 10.4, Launchdate has been the replacement for init, and it runs as process ID 1. It replaces init, RC, cron, watchdog, system starter, many more. A lot of the services it replaces are still available. They're just considered depreciated. It's grown a lot since 10.4. I think in 10.4 had like maybe a dozen launch daemons. In 10.7.3 I counted 133 launch agents and 228 launch daemons, and I'll get into what the difference between those two. An interesting note is iOS actually also runs Launchdate. So that means it's in your iPhones, your iPads, Apple TV too. So I think the users of Launchdate falls into three main groups. The first is Apple. They use that for most of their services, and my advice is just look at what they do with Launchdate, but don't touch it, don't make any changes there. But they have some great examples already on your systems. The second one is developers, which we won't be covering. But if you are a Mac developer, you can do a lot of cool things with Launchdate, and it makes your life a lot easier. And finally is system admins, which is you. And what you may not know is a lot of tools you may already be using, like Monkey, Puppet, Casper Suite, and the Deploy Studio already use Launchdate. So first I wanted to quickly go over the startup sequence for a successful startup sequence for Mac, and just show you how important Launchdate is. So first, when your Mac powers on, you hear you hit the boot ROM, you post, you hear the boot chime, you get to the EFI stage, so where you see the gray Apple logo, and then you start seeing the little gray spinner underneath the Apple logo. So that'll be the kernel loading, and after the kernel loads, you're handing your system over to Launchdate. So Launchdate is running as process 1. Once you see that blue screen, Launchdate is running, and then you see the login window. The login window is a special Launchdate environment, which we'll talk about a little later. And then after a user logs in and you see the desktop, the user's dock, you're in the launch agent environment of Launchdate, and you actually have spawned your own Launchdate process. So there are 4 main components to Launchdate. Launchdate itself, Launchdate plist, launchctl, or launch control, and launchdate.conf. Launchdate.plist is your complete configuration for your Launchdate items. You have one per Launchdate job. It's what gets loaded on startup, and login and tells Launchdate everything it needs to know about your item. Launchctl then is the interface that you use to communicate with Launchdate. You either run it as the administrator level or the regular user. So like I said, after logging in, you spawn your own Launchdate session. So if you want to use the root session, you have to sudo. Launchdate.conf is not used often, but it's the global configuration file for Launchdate. We'll talk about that a little later. And then an important note is each of these components has a man page, so check that out. If you go to developer.apple.com, you can see all the historic man pages. So if you're dealing with multiple OSs, you can see the differences and how it's changed. So the first one is Launchdate itself, and Launchdate defines its jobs, defines processes as jobs, and each job is configured with that Launchdate plist file, which at the minimum defines the label and what the program should do and when it should do it. Launchdate items can also, or Launchdate jobs can also be called items. I tend to refer to the plist as the item, and then once the job is loaded by the system, it's a job. But it's called both. So then I just want to cover the difference between agents and daemons. It's a very important difference, and it depends where you install your Launchdate plist. Launch agents run as a logged-in user, whereas launch daemons always run as a root. Because you can have multiple users of your system, you can have multiple launch agent sessions. Launch agents get loaded at login, and launch daemons are loaded at boot. Launch agents can have a user interface, where launch daemons cannot. A lot of times, you won't even see a user interface with a launch agent, but you can have like helper agents or something like that. Launch agents can be per user or for all users, and launch daemons are at the system level. And then for launch agents, again, you can have multiple instances, multiple users, and launch daemons, you only have one instance, so if you try to load another instance of that job, you won't be able to. I think it's a little difficult to see, but I think the best way to describe it is if you open up Activity Monitor. If you open up Activity Monitor, go into the tree view, you'll be able to see Launchdate running as process 1. It's up at the top, and then your Launchdate session loaded further down running as you. And then the Launchdate plist is probably the most complex component. You can put them in a number of locations, and you put them in a certain location depending on if it's an agent or a daemon. So first off, you can put it in your home directory, library launch agents. That's the per user level. Not incredibly useful unless you only have a single user system. The second location is library launch agents. You put an agent there, it'll be loaded by all users logging into that system. And then you have the library launch daemons, which would be all system-wide daemons provided by the administrator. And then the final two, which important to know but don't touch them again, is the system library launch agents and system library launch daemons. And those are provided by Apple. Again, look at those for examples. There's tons of them in there, 300 or so. So this is your basic Launchdate plist. Still a little hard to see, but at the top there's a label. It's defined by the label key. Everything is in XML. And if XML scares you, don't worry. You don't really need to type out the headers or anything. You can copy those or use GUI tools. It's probably one of the most basic ones you can create. So you have the label, which defines the unique name of the job. Then you have the program arguments, which define what is going to be run. And then you have a trigger, or in this case, a run at load. So as soon as this job is loaded, that script is executed. And again, if XML scares you, this is the same plist file loaded in Xcode. So if you want to start looking at Launchdate, probably a good idea to load Xcode on your system. Launchdate again has a few required keys. The first one is label. Every Launchdate daemon or agent has a unique identifier, meaning the label. It's typically reverse DNS. So it'd be like if your organization, and then if it's specified to a specific server, you can get as granular as you want or stick to the organization level. And then unique to the script. The second one is using program or program arguments. You don't need to use both. In fact, you shouldn't use both. But simply what that specifies is the path to whatever it is you're running with Launchdate. And then you have some kind of trigger or a demand. So you can have a run at load, a start interval, which is a calendar timer, or a start on mount, which triggers if any device mounts, Launchdate would run, or your job would run. And then there's a few other common keys. One is the keep alive, usually used just for developers, but then the watch paths, environment variables, disabled, abandoned process group, standard out, start interval, and we'll get into all those. Sure.
Where do you find a complete list of the triggers?
In the Launchdate plist man page. A very important note at the bottom, if you're using a launch daemon, your permissions have to be set to root wheel, and it can't be writable by anyone else. It's just a security issue. I don't think that was the case in 10.4, but I think 10.5 and higher. And you want to make sure so in the command line, you would chown root wheel and then chmod 644, which gives you the read-write, read-read permissions. Okay, so now I'm going to start just talking about a few of those specific keys in the Launchdate plist. The first one is keep alive. Keep alive can be either a dictionary, which is a set of keys, or just simply true. If you set it to true, Launchdate expects to always run your job, no matter if it's, as soon as it's loaded, it's run, and it's always running. And if it dies, Launchdate will try to restart it. You primarily use this to configure something that's always running, like a web server. But if you're using this, just ask yourself, does my job really need to run all the time? And if you do want to use keep alive, look at Monkey's Launchdate items. There's quite a few of them in there and really good examples. In keep alive, they have something called the path state, and that can say if that path, if a file system path, like a directory or a file exists, then keep that job alive. So you can have conditional keep alives. It can be true or false, so if that file doesn't exist. You can also do successful exit, so as long as this job exits successfully, it will stay alive, or the inverse, if it doesn't, it'll try to stay alive. And then network state, so if that one you may want to look at the Launchdate man page for, but it tries to judge whether or not the network is up and then run your job that way. And then an important note again, jobs that will exit quickly and frequently will be throttled. So if your job dies, it'll restart in 5 seconds, and it'll continue to do that until it's just unloaded, and then your job won't run anymore. Another popular one is start calendar interval. It functions a lot like cron, except probably a few limitations and a little more complex. Is anyone using cron? It's interesting to note is cron is actually managed. You still use cron in OS 10 in line, but it's managed through, it's run by Launchdate. So you can do something like have a once per day, weekly, hourly. Unlike cron, if you miss an event, it just doesn't run. Launchdate will merge all the missed events into one event and then run that the next time the system boots or wakes up. It can be a dictionary of integers or an array, which basically means you can do multiple intervals. So you can have multiple start calendar intervals. And any missing values are treated as wildcards. So I have an example coming up too. That's not too bad. So this is Apple's periodic daily launch daemon. So in their program arguments, they call periodic, and program arguments are separated. So what you would separate by space on the command line, you separate as individual strings in program arguments. And then what I wanted to show was in start calendar interval, you say they have hours set to 3 and minutes set to 15. So this script would run at 3:15 every day. Very similar to start calendar interval is start interval, but instead of a calendar schedule based on the system clock, it's based on the number of seconds. So you would specify start interval of a number of seconds. So your 60 seconds be your minute, and then every 60 seconds that job is spawned. It can be very useful for load balancing and randomizing. So if you're pushing these daemons out to a bunch of clients and you set a calendar interval, and that downloads something or does something, you have to expect that all that load on your network. Where if you set a start interval, laptops are opening and closing at different times. People are logging in and out at different times. So you've
Already you said 3:15, so is it 24-hour period? So like if you want like 3:15 in the afternoon would be 15.
Yep, 24 hours clock. And I kind of have a story about this, but using semantics live update, having a bunch of clients update at the same time, you can a semantic pushes out a big virus definition update. You can really see that on your network if all your clients are downloading that at the same time. And so another one is watch path and queue directories. They sound similar, but they're very different. Watch paths takes an array of strings. Each string is then a path to a location on the file system. And if any one of those paths are modified, your job is triggered. And the path doesn't need to exist to be in that watch paths. And if it gets created, it isn't considered a modification. So that it has to be created and then modified in order to run. And then queue directories is it takes an array of strings again, and it's the path is a directory, and the directory is not empty. So your job is expected to process something on that directory to remove those files, and you have to watch out for if you browse to that directory that you said, the DS store files will trigger that. So here I have a few more examples. So this is Apple's periodic weekly again. Runs once per week, Saturdays. So it uses, for the weekday key in the start calendar interval, it uses 0 and 7 as Sundays. And then the second one is the periodic monthly. So again, it sets the day value to 1. Causing this to run, whenever that value is true, which is the first of the month. And then the other one up above is the backup D, which is time machine, and it has a start interval of 3600, which is an hour. So that's what causes time machine to run every hour. And then another one, time machine actually uses like 3 or 4 different Launchdate items. Another one is attach. And it uses the start on mount to true. So any device gets attached, that job is triggered, and the time machine says, is this my backup drive? If it is, maybe I should back up. The only one I could find that really used the queue directories is the panic reporter, report panic. And what I assume this probably does is if your machine would kernel panic, dumps that kernel panic log, that report into that directory, and then on boot, this daemon then sees that and processes that and asks you if you want to send it to Apple or not. Another one is, I think, a new one. It's the App Store Update Agent, and that uses a start interval of 14,400. So that's processing. It's what I assume is probably checking for App Store updates every 4 days. The last one is cron. So anyone using cron, cron is managed through Launchdate. And it uses the keep alive with the path state. So as long as your cron tab exists, Launchdate runs it. A common question is, do I use program or program arguments? And the answer is either, but don't use both. I recommend always using program arguments just to stay consistent, but basically they do the same function. Program just takes one single path, whereas program arguments takes the path as the first value as a string, and then any arguments you need to pass to your binary, your script, go after that.
Would you be able to put arguments in the program key?
No. Yeah, if you put spaces in there, it won't. Yep. This one, the abandoned process group, it looks complicated, but what it really means is when a Launchdate job dies or gets unloaded, any processes spawned by that also get unloaded, which is you log out or you kill the login window, you end your session, and everything under your session gets unloaded. That's a pretty good example. If you set this key to true, it just disables that. If you don't put it in, it defaults to false. Which means I've run into it with scripts that send emails through Launchdate. At the end of your script, you might have it generated some kind of file, and you want to send that report off. Well, without this set, that mail process, that mail message might not get sent before Launchdate unloads. Then it would kill that mail process. If you didn't want to use this, you could also just use a sleep command at the end of your script. That way, you give your job as much time as you think it needs to send that mail message or do something. And if it doesn't do it in that amount of time, you want to kill it anyway. So once the sleep ends, the job's unloaded and it's done. I use this kind of interesting way using Deploy Studio. Deploy Studio, when you're running it, you have all your inventory information. So if you have an inventory system you upload to or manage, just a spreadsheet, you can put in a script in Deploy Studio that sends all that back to the server. On the server side, have a Launchdate item then that scans that directory of that file for that information and then emails that out. Okay, and for logging, so if you would just run your script in the terminal window, any output you see there can be logged using Launchdate. You just put in the path to your logs in either standard out or standard error, and make sure that whoever's running, the running user of the Launchdate job has the right permissions to the file. And you can send both the standard out and standard error messages to the same log. There's no issue. And that's just another string, so it takes just the path to your log file. Probably in var log or library log. Okay, so then we get to launchctl. And launchctl is essential for debugging and testing and doing anything with Launchdate. It's user specific, so if you want to load at the system level, launch daemon, use sudo. Launchctl can load your daemons, start and stop jobs, and set environment variables. If you just call launchctl, it's just it's a shell environment for Launchdate. If you would call launchctl list, you would get a listing of all your jobs. If you do sudo launchctl list, you get all the system jobs. And when you get that list, you'll get a number of items that look like this, but you'll see a dash. And if you see a number there, that's the running process ID. 0, that column shows the last exit status of your job. So the last time this one ran, it was successful, exit 0. And then you'll see that label that identifies your job. So that reverse DNS label. To load and unload, you just call launchctl load, and then the path to your launchDP list. Once it's loaded, again, you can't load the same job twice. You can do a list. You'll see that label in there as it's loaded, and you can start and stop it.
Do the permissions come from where it lives? If that's launching from there, then that gets permissions as well?
yes. On boot though, so launch daemons are loaded when the system loads. So if you were loading this manually, you do sudo launchctl load. The file level permissions are important then on that plist file. So they won't be loaded automatically if they're not set correctly, especially on launch daemons. And the other one we have here is the Launchdate conf file. It lives in etc launchdate.conf. It probably doesn't exist by default, so you may have to create it and use the same permissions that you would set on the launchdate plist file. But basically anything in launchdate conf, it takes commands like launchctl would. So if you can do it in there, you can do it in here, and you just set it, and it'll run on load or run on system boot actually. So my advice would be to probably avoid using it if you can. If you can't, I think it's still a better alternative than modifying any of Apple's launch daemons. And this is just an example I used, but if anyone's supporting Oracle databases, you could use something like this to configure Oracle. The instant client kind of has some special requirements. Use that with the OCI, I think, to work with Apache and PHP in OS 10. And an important note is it's loaded once at boot. So in order to modify it and get it to reload, you have to restart your system. So just make sure you always test it first. You don't want that to reboot your system and not have it come back up because of something you did.
So if you're saying you don't normally want to put your stuff in there, where do you normally put your setting?
I would try to find a workaround in your script or in your code.
When's Launchdate going to call you can have a script that comes up at runtime and...
Right, you would set like paths in here or in variables. If you can do it in your script rather than in the configuration file. But if you can't, the alternative would, if you're trying to do something with Apple's launch daemon process, instead of modifying Apple's own plist, look at using this. And then I think this is under 10.7. You can also put a Launchdate configuration file in your home directory. But I believe this is as of 10.7.3. In the man page, they consider it unsupported. It may or may not work, and it may not work in the future. That may be what that means. Okay, and Launchdate's changed quite a bit since 10.4. So I kind of tried to outline some of the changes. The first one was the on-demand. Originally in 10.4, on-demand was a key similar to keep alive, but it defaulted to true. So if you didn't want your script to run all the time, you would have to set that to false. And also there was a 60-second maximum run or minimum runtime. So if your script didn't live for 60 seconds, it would be considered a failure. After 10 failed attempts, it would be unloaded. In 10.5, they introduced the limit load to session type, which helps with launch agents. You can use the limit load to session type, and if you specify Aqua, that means your launch agent won't be triggered for like an SSH login session. And then in 10.5, they also introduced the keep alive, which it supersedes on-demand, and it does a lot more than on-demand did. In 10.6, the disabled key. So if you set disabled true in your Launchdate plist, your job would be disabled, and it was modifying the actual Launchdate plist. In 10.6, they moved that, and so that's actually under private var db launchd.db, and for your launch daemons, it's a directory com.apple.launched, and then there's an overrides plist in there, which has your label, and then disabled true or false. And then for launch agents, that file is actually com.apple.launched.peruser, and then the UID of that user. So it's specific to the user, and if you browse in there, you only be able to get into, you only have permissions to the user you're logged in as. If you see that your job is loading manually, but it's not automatically, you might want to check out if it's disabled in there. So I just have a few tips on creating your own scripts for Launchdate. Where should you put them? Usually I would put them in library scripts or user local. Library scripts is nice because it's visible, and then user local is nice because it's the opposite. You know, you don't have users messing with it; they can't browse to it. And then secondly, watch out for any dependencies, especially dependencies on like the network or directory services. Directory services may or may not be alive, so you may not even be able to figure out, does this user exist or doesn't exist? Who am I? Those dependencies you should probably try to work into your scripts. So try pinging your domain controller. If you have a Launchdate first boot script that binds to your domain, your Active Directory domain, make sure you can get out, test everything, and don't assume anything. And then your environment. Launchdate runs under special environments, so if you have any custom paths or anything set up in your shell environment, it won't exist there. This is probably where that launchdate.conf file would come in. And you want to make sure that you specify the path to your shell, so bin bash, full paths if you need them. You can just use full paths in your scripts. And exit 0. If you don't exit 0, your Launchdate will consider your job has failed. It'll try it again, and eventually it'll just unload it, and it won't run anymore. And if you use first boot scripts, so if you're copying Launchdate plist down in with Deploy Studio or any other deployment tools to be run on first boot, you want to make sure you clean that up after yourself. So you would do an RM and then just the path to your plist file. Take care of it. You shouldn't have to worry about unloading it the next time a user logs in or the next time the system reboots. It won't be loaded anyway. And then do just a secure remove on the script itself, just to clean up. And always test first. Make sure your script runs fine on the terminal. You don't have any issues. Test on multiple clients, multiple versions of the OS. And if you're looking just to start, make your own Launchdate item, a good place to start I've found is the Apache plist file, and that's in system library, launch Damons. So you can just browse to that on your system, grab a copy of it, just drag it out to your desktop, start changing it, delete any of the keys you don't need, and add in the ones you do. And then I have a quick demo. Let's see. So first thing I wanted to show was just where these live. So jumping to Launch Damons, library Launch Damons, you can see with a clean install, this would be empty. So you can tell there's quite a few third parties using it already. And I'm just going to go over a few that I've done. First, I wanted to show the on-demand nature of Launchdate. Let's see. So for something like SSH, SSH utilizes the on-demand feature of Launchdate, so unless someone's accessing it, it's not running. So if I go in and turn on remote login, no SSH running. But the moment I initiate the SSH connection, then SSHD is firing up. It's ready for the connection. It's responded to that action. And that's true of like FTP and a lot of other services. So it's very efficient. It's not all these services aren't running all the time. which is why the Launchdate really helps the OS boot a lot faster, because it's not loading everything, it's just loading what it needs. As soon as that session ends, those processes go away. In the college, we like to statically name everything. So I've been using a launch daemon I made, and it simply just takes a string of arguments. There's actually no script even involved here. So it simply calls the system setup command to set the computer name with my computer name, and then also the local subnet name. So if you would write that on the terminal, it'd be system setup space set computer name, my computer name space dash local subnet name, and my computer name again. So in this, you can see is set to run at load. So as soon as the system boots, my launch daemon is loaded and the computer name is set. And that's good enough for us. You know, sometimes you plug into a network or plug and unplug quick, you might see that your computer name is taken, so it's renamed you, and you have the 2, 1, 2, 3 starting after your computer name. It's good enough for us if after the system reboots, it sets the name back again. So I can kind of show how that works. So if the user would change their computer name, let's see. And so since this is a launch daemon, you use sudo. And you can see it's running, so set computer name. And then to start that process, since it would normally be triggered on load, which is on boot, we can just call launchctl and then start. So, and then you start it with the label of your launch daemon. So as soon as that runs, sets my computer. And I use this actually with Deploy Studio. So because Deploy Studio already knows the computer name, Deploy Studio just automatically generates this plist, copies it in after the system is done imaging. First boot, computer name is set. Another one I use is to enable Kerberos space printing. So I simply want to set a variable on each printer as it comes in, and I use the watch paths. So this Launchdate item monitors that etccups printers.conf. That printers.conf has a list of all the printers installed on your system. If you add or remove a printer, that file changes. So every time that file changes, this launch daemon runs. And then my standard out, standard error, just have a simple log path. So any errors, any messages get logged in there. So if I open up that log, you can see it running.
How did you redirect that?
Redirect what? Oh. You set the standard out path and standard error path. As long as the running user of Launchdate has right permissions, it'll work. So when that watch path gets modified, that script gets kicked off. Should we go insert marker? So if you do a touch command, it'll modify that file. That file was etccups printers. So as soon as that file's modified, Launchdate recognizes that modification date changed, and the script runs. And the last one I wanted to show, just to look at those permissions. I don't know if you saw permission levels or setting the execute on scripts. If you look in library, launch daemons, this is is what you're looking for. So you want root wheel, and you don't want anyone else to be able to write to these. One catch is you also want to make sure that no one else has write access to your Damons scripts. Launchdate will check the plist file, but it won't check the script. And you don't want to allow just anyone to modify a script that's run as root. So now I have that generic plist here, the very basic one. If I look at the permissions on that, so the permissions are off, they're not set, right? So when I try to load that, you see dubious ownership on file skipping and nothing found to load. So to change that, you would simply say shown, change root wheel. Once it's changed, permissions are set right, reload it, and it works fine. And then if I do a sudo launch, you can see it's loaded. So edu school name, script name. Let's see, and like I said, Damons can only be loaded once, so if I would try to load that again, I would see it's already loaded. Any questions there?
So when you're running, you can do it unload?
Yep. Yeah, so if I go back and unload list, it's not loaded anymore. Loaded is always different than running, but that's essentially what it would do. So, and you can see I loaded that, for testing purposes, I loaded that directly from my desktop. But the only way that your launch daemon will actually get automatically loaded if it's in one of those certain paths, so library launch agents or library launch daemons. And I have a few resources for you. So if you're uncomfortable with the XML syntax, you can use Xcode. There used to be a tool called Property List Editor, but I think that was merged in with Xcode and Xcode 4. Another one is Lingon or Lingon, however you want to pronounce it. It's been around for a while, and it's now in the Mac App Store. I think it's like $2.99. Version 3, I think there's been some complaints about it doesn't do as much, probably because it's limited to what Apple allows in the App Store. Otherwise, version 2, I think, is freely available still. And it just gives you a nice, clean Launchdate interface to make those Launchdate plist files. It's just a plist, so if you want to, you can dynamically create them in a script, so using like the defaults command, or use any other plain text editor, TextEdit, Text Wrangler. Second one is you want to check out the man pages. It has everything you need to know. They're very extensive, especially check out the Launchdate plist man page. And if you're supporting multiple OSs, they have a drop-down list. You can scan back and look at the changes in that. And then AFP 548, a while back, it's a little dated now, but when Launchdate came out, I think in Leopard, they wrote this. And so it's a good overview if you want to learn more about it, how it works and what it's doing. And then another one that's slightly dated but very good is the Launchdate One Program to Rule Them All with Dave Zarsky. And that's out in Google. He was part of a Google Tech Talk. He's actually the developer of Launchdate. So if anyone knows about it, it's him. And any questions? Sure.
Yeah, I'd written a Launchdate a while ago to launch a Java application server like Lastfish, Tomcat, and I had issues with running a script that then needed to run Java to launch the
to fire up the application server. I ended up having my way around that, but would abandon process group solve that issue?
Are you?
Because when that script died, when the script stopped running,
Yep.
so did the Java process.
Right, and if that script is kicking off that Java process, yeah, once that script's done, the Java process is gone. You could, but you're kind of losing that control in Launchdate, because once that process is severed, Launchdate doesn't care about it anymore. So useful to start it, not useful to stop it, unload, or do anything after that.
All I really needed to do was start.
Yeah.
Because normally with all of those, there's so many environment variables you have to set up and all this. I don't want to put that in launchd.com.
Okay.
Too much junk.
Mm-hmm.
But so that would work. Okay.
You
I wasn't aware of that flag.
If it's just environment variables, you may want to look at the environment variable key in the plist.
Okay.
So you can set all those in your plist too.
You can as well?
Yep.
Okay. When did abandoned process group arrive? You know?
I think it might have been 10.6.
Okay.
Sure.
Can you use this to launch a network share, or is that coming before network?
Depends. Like connect to a network share. You probably want to, if you set that up as a launch agent, make sure regardless the network is up before you attempt to connect to it. It should work. It'll be running as that user and amount on their desktop.
So you have to run it as an individual user?
As a launch agent, yeah. And you won't be able to prompt them for a password or anything. So you probably want to make sure Kerberos is set up or some kind of anonymous share.
I know you can set the hour which to launch something. And you can also say, and launch it every 60 minutes. Is there a way to granularly say, launch on the hour, every hour?
Yes. So you would use, so you would just use the minute key. So you set the minute to 30, and then every time that's true, yeah, it would run. Basically, the minute key would cause it to run hourly whenever that minute value was.
Because I noticed I've got one right now. So whenever I restart the server, it's maybe it started 10 minutes after the hour, and then it's 20 minutes depending on when I restarted the server.
You're using the calendar interval or the start interval?
It might be the calendar interval.
Yes. So if you specify the minute, it would specify the minute on which that job would be run per hour.
I want to be able to say, and your queue gets checked on the hour every hour.
I think you might have to use cron in that case, because won't this, if it hasn't run, it's going to try to catch up?
It will, right? Is this on a server?
Yeah.
So you probably should be okay then.
So what I do is I make sure it's on the hour when I start it, just to
okay.
work. But there's power outages, and then all of a sudden it's doing it every 25 minutes after the hour or something like that.
Okay.
And I just wonder if it's possible.
Any other questions? Sure.
This is probably in the man file, but the network flag on network, is that an on-off, or is there a transition, or is that tied to interface? Or is it just yes or no, do we have network or not?
Yeah, I know there's more about it in the man page, but I think what it does, I think they even say it in there, it's not 100%. What it's doing is saying if you have any non-loopback address to keep alive. So if you tied that into a script, you'd probably want to put more checks in your script and make sure that work, but it's a good starting point. Any other questions? I think that wraps it up. So, thank you all for coming.